Britain has a particular relationship with secrecy. It is not loud about it the way some countries are. There are no dramatic announcements, no press briefings about what the government has decided you no longer need to be protected from. Documents simply appear at the National Archives in queue, quietly transferred under whatever version of the disclosure rules applies that year, and the assumption is that enough time has passed that the embarrassment has become history. Sometimes it has. Sometimes it hasn't. What follows are 12 things the British government classified, suppressed, or actively concealed from its own citizens for decades, all of which are now confirmed as public record. Some were kept quiet for 30 years. Several were kept quiet for 50 or more. A few were buried so thoroughly that only lawsuits, rogue journalists, or accidental discoveries forced them into the open at all. Taken together, they describe a government that treated secrecy as a standard operating procedure applied across military operations, intelligence failures, colonial atrocities, and the personal lives of people who worked inside the palace. Here are what were in the files. Number 1. Britain's most damaging spy of the 20th century was running its entire intelligence apparatus while simultaneously reporting everything to Moscow, and the government hid its own incompetence about this for over 60 years. Harold Adrian Russell Philby, known universally as Kim, was recruited by Soviet intelligence in 1934. He was 22 years old and had just graduated from Cambridge. As over the following years he rose through the ranks of the British intelligence services with extraordinary speed, eventually becoming head of MI6's Soviet counterintelligence section, which meant he was simultaneously the person most responsible for catching Soviet spies inside Britain and the most valuable Soviet spy inside Britain. He also served as MI6's liaison officer in Washington during the early Cold War, which placed him at the shared center of British and American intelligence operations at the most sensitive point in the 20th century. Everything passed through him: nuclear intelligence, agent networks, defectors, signals operations. All of it went directly to Moscow. He is known to have betrayed at least one man to his death. A Soviet intelligence officer named Konstantin Volkov had privately approached the British in 1945, offering to defect and provide detailed information about Soviet penetration of Western intelligence services. The offer was routed to the officer responsible for handling it. That officer was Kim Philby. Volkov and his wife were on a plane back to Moscow within weeks. They were executed in the Lubyanka prison. Volkov had specifically offered to name 3 Soviet agents working inside the British intelligence apparatus. Philby was almost certainly one of the 3 names he intended to hand over. Files released by the National Archives in January 2025 contain the actual confession Philby gave on January 11, 1963, when a senior MI6 officer confronted him in Beirut. The 6-page document is incomplete. A partial confession covering 1932 to 1946 only, and Philby gave no convincing account of why he supposedly stopped after that point. The transcript is headed with his MI5 codename, Peach, under which he had been tracked since falling under suspicion in 1951. 3 days after handing over the statement, he disappeared from Beirut and surfaced in Moscow aboard a Soviet freighter. He lived there until his death in 1988, progressively disillusioned with the Soviet system he had served for decades, drinking heavily, largely ignored by the KGB he had given his career to. The files also reveal that the British government conducted an active campaign for years to keep Philby's spying confidential even after they knew the truth, specifically to minimize political embarrassment. More than 20% of the documents relating to the Cambridge 5 cases remained redacted or sealed even after the 2025 release. Number 2. The Queen's personal art advisor was a confessed Soviet spy, she was told in secret, and the public was not informed for 15 more years. Anthony Blunt was one of the most distinguished figures in British cultural life. He was a Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, Director of the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, Surveyor of the Queen's Pictures, and a Knight of the Realm. He was also a Soviet intelligence agent who had worked inside MI5 during the Second World War and passed substantial quantities of classified intelligence to his handlers. After Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean fled to Moscow in 1951, and suspicion mounted around the broader Cambridge network, MI5 interviewed Blunt multiple times over more than a decade. Without a confession and without direct evidence sufficient for prosecution, they could not act. The files released in January 2025 include the transcript of the interview that finally broke through. On April 23, 1964, MI5 officer Arthur Martin visited Blunt at his flat above the Courtauld Institute and offered him a deal: immunity from prosecution in exchange for a full confession. Blunt accepted. Martin left the interview believing that Blunt was still withholding certain information, and he was almost certainly right. The deal was so tightly held that the Prime Minister at the time, Alec Douglas Home, was never told about it. He learned of Blunt's confession in November 1979, the same day the rest of the country did, and when Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher announced it to the House of Commons. In the 15 years between Blunt's confession and Thatcher's announcement, Blunt continued in his official role as the Queen's art advisor, appearing at royal functions, giving lectures, receiving honors. He was stripped of his knighthood on the day Thatcher spoke. He died 5 years later. A note in the newly declassified files, dated March 1973, records that the Queen's private secretary had spoken to the monarch about Blunt's confession. The Queen had known for 9 years by that point. The note recorded that she took it all very calmly and without surprise. Number 3. Britain sailed 31 nuclear weapons into a declared nuclear-free zone during the Falklands War, panicked internally about what would happen if the public found out, and kept the exact number secret for 40 years. When Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands on April 2, 1982, the Royal Navy assembled a task force and sent it south within days. What was not disclosed at the time, and what the Ministry of Defense only partially acknowledged in 2003, was that several of the warships in that task force were carrying nuclear weapons as part of their standard Cold War armament. The weapons were WE-177 nuclear depth charges, designed primarily for use against submarines. A file marked Top Secret Atomic, transferred to the National Archives in 2022, reveals the full picture for the first time. As the ships sailed south, officials in London became alarmed. An MOD minute, dated April 6, 1982, 4 days into the crisis, noted what it described as huge concern that some of the nuclear depth bombs could be lost or damaged, and the fact become public. The minute added that the international repercussions of such an incident could be very damaging. The Foreign Office asked the Navy to remove the weapons from the ships. The Navy refused on the grounds that unloading at Ascension Island would delay the task force and could not be kept secret. Instead, the weapons were consolidated from the smaller frigates onto the 2 aircraft carriers, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, where the secure magazines were better protected. By the middle of May 1982, Hermes was carrying 18 nuclear weapons and Invincible 12. A third ship, RFA Regent, carried one. All 31 were inside the total exclusion zone Britain had imposed around the Falkland Islands. The problem was the Treaty of Tlatelolco, signed in 1967, which established a nuclear-free zone across Latin America and the surrounding waters, explicitly including the Falklands. Britain had signed and ratified the treaty. Margaret Thatcher insisted that no ship carrying nuclear weapons would enter the 3-mile territorial limit around the islands themselves, which she considered a potential breach of the treaty, even if the exclusion zone was technically broader. The Foreign Office was additionally anxious about a specific vessel. After the destroyer HMS Sheffield was struck and sunk by an Argentine Exocet missile in May 1982, a senior Foreign Office official wrote to his MOD counterpart expressing relief upon receiving confirmation that Sheffield had not been carrying a nuclear weapon when she was hit. The MOD admitted in 2003 that nuclear weapons had been present in the task force. The exact number, 31, was not confirmed until the 2022 National Archives release. Argentina's foreign ministry subsequently demanded formal assurances and raised the matter with the British government as a serious violation of international arms agreements. Several documents from the file remain withheld, including a note dated April 11, 1982, which begins with the words, "The Chiefs of Staff believe." What they believed is still not public. Number 4. Britain secretly burned and dumped at sea the documentary evidence of its colonial rule across 37 countries, using a systematic program that ran for 20 years, and then denied the archive existed until a judge forced the admission. As the British Empire contracted through the 1950s and 1960s, officials in the Colonial Office in London became increasingly concerned about what independence would mean for the documentary record. The concern was direct. Documents existed that showed colonial authorities authorizing torture, deploying extrajudicial violence, operating racial classification systems, using informers, and suppressing political movements. These could not be left for new governments to find. The program was eventually codenamed Operation Legacy. It ran from roughly the 1950s through the 1970s, affecting at least 37 former colonies, from Kenya and Malaya to Nigeria, Cyprus, Aden, the Bahamas, British Guiana, and dozens of others. Colonial Secretary Ian MacLeod formalized the instructions in a telegram sent to all British posts on May 3, 1961. Documents that might embarrass the British government, expose informers, reveal intelligence sources, or be interpreted as evidence of racial prejudice were to be either destroyed or secretly returned to Britain. Those sent back to London were to travel only on British ships, entrusted only to British officers. Documents that could not be shipped were to be burned or placed in well-weighted crates and sunk in deep and current-free water at the maximum practicable distance from shore. Officials were warned to ensure the files disappeared without leaving gaps. Legacy files must leave no reference to watch material, one instruction stated. Indeed, the very existence of the watch series, though it may be guessed at, should never be revealed. In April 1957, 5 unmarked lorries left the British High Commission in Kuala Lumpur and drove to a Royal Navy base in Singapore. Their destination was, in the words of one colonial official, a splendid incinerator. 5 lorry loads of documents from Malaya were destroyed in a single operation, described by those carrying it out as done discreetly. Officials in Aden began burning files in 1966, 12 months before British withdrawal. In British Guyana, the task fell to 2 secretaries and an oil drum in the grounds of Government House, before the army was called in to help. The 8,800 files that were not destroyed were quietly shipped to Britain and stored at a secure government facility at Hanslope Park in Buckinghamshire, which it shared with MY5 and MY6. They were held there, outside the public record system, for decades. The British government did not volunteer their existence. When lawyers representing Kenyan survivors of colonial-era torture filed disclosure requests, the Foreign Office explicitly stated that all relevant documents had been transferred to the National Archives. That was false. In April 2011, after a High Court judge hearing the Kenyan case ordered full disclosure, the Foreign Office admitted that the Hanslope Archive existed. By November 2013, roughly 20,000 files from 37 former colonies had been released. Nobody knows how many were destroyed before they could be recovered. Number 5. Britain authorized systematic torture in colonial Kenya in writing, and the document authorizing it was kept out of public reach for over 50 years. Between 1952 and 1960, Britain fought a counterinsurgency campaign in Kenya against the Mau Mau independence movement. The official account presented to the British public described a program of rehabilitation designed to help detained Kenyans who had taken the Mau Mau oath return to productive civic life. The camps holding them were described as correctional facilities. What was actually happening in those camps is documented in a memo written in June 1957 by Eric Griffiths Jones, the Attorney General of the British colonial government in Kenya. The memo authorized specific forms of physical coercion against detainees who refused to cooperate. One passage describing what should happen to a resistant prisoner specified that guards should place a foot on his throat and stuff mud in his mouth. Another line stated that in the last resort, a detainee should be knocked unconscious. The document was initialed and approved. It came from the Attorney General. It traveled up the chain of command. It was sanctioned. Between 1953 and 1960, somewhere between 70,000 and 150,000 people were detained without trial across an archipelago of camps in Kenya. None had been charged with or convicted of any crime. The Kenya Human Rights Commission has estimated that more than 100,000 Kenyans were killed, tortured, or permanently injured during the emergency period. Documented methods included what camp authorities called the dilution technique, in which non-cooperating detainees were housed with cooperating ones who subjected them to sustained psychological and physical pressure. A variation called the Mwea procedure used direct physical force on prisoners immediately upon their arrival at a detention facility. Castration, rape, and systematic beating were documented in testimony from survivors and confirmed in the files released from Hanslope Park. In 2013, the British government apologized and agreed to pay £19.9 million in compensation to more than 5,000 surviving claimants. Foreign Secretary William Hague said in the House of Commons that the government sincerely regrets that these abuses took place. A permanent memorial was unveiled in Nairobi in September 2015. The files authorizing the abuses had been held at Hanslope Park for over 50 years before the High Court forced their disclosure. Number 6. Britain built a secret underground city large enough for the entire cabinet, with over 60 miles of internal roads, and told the press it was a regional facility if anyone asked. Near Corsham in Wiltshire, about 2 kilometers to the west of the town centre, the British government spent years constructing what can only be described as a subterranean small city. It went by several classified code names over the decades, including Stockwell, Subterfuge, Burlington, and Turnstile. The full complex stretched over 1 kilometer in length and contained more than 60 miles of internal roads. It was designed to accommodate the Prime Minister, the entire cabinet, up to 4,000 civil servants, and domestic support staff in complete isolation from the surface world for up to 3 months following a nuclear strike. The facility had hospitals, canteens, kitchens, laundries, offices, accommodation areas, communications equipment, and storage for enough supplies to keep its population functioning through the post-strike period. It was the British government's answer to the question of how the people who ran the country would survive a Soviet nuclear attack. The people who ran the country, it turned out, had a very specific answer. They would be in Wiltshire. Government press officers were issued with cover stories for use if journalists asked about the facility. Declassified files from 1967 show that the official line to be given to any inquiry was that the installation had been developed to provide regional facilities. That was it. No further information. Press officers were expected to repeat this line regardless of what they were actually asked, and to provide nothing else. The facility's existence was first revealed not by the government, but by journalist Duncan Campbell, who described it in his 1982 book, War Plan UK. The site was eventually declassified after the Cold War ended, though it remains on the Ministry of Defense estate and is generally not available for public visits. Number 7. Britain built a network of secret nuclear emergency bunkers across the country without telling Parliament, and the network was exposed by a group of activists who broke into one and published a pamphlet. Alongside the turnstile facility for the cabinet, the British government developed from 1958 onward a separate network of regional seats of government, known as RSGs, designed to allow regional administration to continue after a nuclear attack. 12 such facilities were created across the country, and each intended to house a regional commissioner with authority to run their portion of Britain independently of London if the capital were destroyed. The RSGs were built between 1958 and 1961. The construction was done in complete secrecy. Parliament was not informed. The press was not informed. The public was not informed. The money was spent and the bunkers were built, and the assumption appears to have been that nobody would need to know until they needed to be used. In 1963, a small anonymous group calling themselves Spies for Peace received a tip about the location of RSG-6, which was housed in an underground facility at Warren Row, between Henley-on-Thames and Maidenhead. They broke into it, documented what they found, and produced a pamphlet called Danger, Official Secret, which they distributed widely before the Easter Aldermaston March against nuclear weapons that year. The pamphlet described in detail what the regional government network was, where the facilities were, and what the government had been planning in secret. Spies for Peace were never caught. The RSGs entered public consciousness that weekend and never fully left. The political scandal that followed centered on the obvious question. The government had been spending significant sums of public money to ensure its own survival in a nuclear war, while simultaneously making no meaningful plans to protect the population who would face annihilation. The RSG network made that calculation explicit. It was kept from Parliament specifically because the calculation was indefensible. Number 8. The existence of Britain's Signals Intelligence Agency was unknown to the public until a magazine published it by accident in 1976, and the code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park was kept secret until 1974. GCHQ, the Government Communications Headquarters, is now one of the most well-known institutions in British intelligence. It intercepts communications, decrypts foreign signals, and provides intelligence assessments to the government. It has operated continuously since it emerged from the Wartime Government Code and Cipher School in 1946. Its existence was unknown to the British public until an article appeared in the magazine Time Out in 1976, 30 years after it was formally constituted. The wartime code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park. which broke the German Enigma cipher and provided intelligence credited with significantly shortening the Second World War, was kept completely secret until 1974. The tens of thousands of people who worked at Bletchley Park or in connected operations across the country spent decades after the war unable to tell anyone what they had done, including, in many cases, their own families. Veterans returned home with no way to explain where they had been or what had occupied them during the war years. Many never discussed it at all. The secrecy was enforced under the Official Secrets Act, which most Bletchley staff had signed. The penalty for disclosure was serious, and the government's position was that the intelligence advantage derived from the fact that foreign powers did not know their codes had been broken was so significant that it could not be compromised even after the war ended. The first major public disclosure came with the publication of F.H. Hinsley's Official History of British Intelligence in the Second World War, which began appearing in 1979. For the veterans who had spent 30 years unable to speak about their work, the official history arrived too late for many of them. A substantial number had died before the secrecy ended. Number 9. Britain secretly planned for the possibility that if nuclear war seemed inevitable, the government would authorize the use of nuclear weapons in a first strike, and kept that planning away from Parliament and the public for decades. The declassified Strath Report, a 1955 document produced by a senior civil servant named William Strath for the government of Prime Minister Anthony Eden, laid out in clinical terms what a Soviet nuclear attack on Britain would look like. The report concluded that a Soviet attack using 10 hydrogen bombs detonated at night would kill 12 million people outright, roughly a third of the country's population at that time, and seriously injure another 4 million. Food and water supplies would be contaminated across the country. Industry would stop. The National Health Service would be entirely overwhelmed. The report was classified for nearly 50 years before being released in 2002. The document was not simply an assessment of damage. It was a planning document, and what it was planning for was the government's response to a scenario in which the destruction it described was considered likely. What the report made unavoidably clear was that neither the civilian population nor the existing infrastructure had any realistic prospect of surviving a major nuclear exchange, and that the government's planning was oriented not toward protecting the population, but toward ensuring governmental continuity and post-attack authority in whatever remained. The Strath Report was classified top secret at the time of its production. The public it described, whose annihilation it calculated in such precise terms, was not informed of either the assessment or the plans built around it. Number 10. The British government ran an organized program of surveillance against its own trade unions, peace campaigners, and political organizations throughout much of the 20th century, and kept the full scope of those operations classified for decades. MI5 files released at various points since the 1990s, and in batches up through the most recent 2025 release, have documented the breadth of domestic surveillance conducted against organizations the government considered politically suspicious. The Communist Party of Great Britain was under continuous surveillance for decades, including the monitoring of members' private telephone calls, mail interceptions, and infiltration by informers. The campaign for nuclear disarmament, the major peace movement of the 1950s and 1960s, was similarly monitored. Trade union officials were watched, their contacts logged, their activities reported. The scale of the operation reflected a consistent view inside the security services that domestic political dissent, particularly on the left, represented a potential threat that warranted intelligence attention. Files show that MI5 maintained surveillance on a range of organizations whose activities were entirely legal and whose members were exercising ordinary rights of association and political expression. The files tracking these activities were held under extended classification periods well beyond the standard 30-year rule, because the subjects of that surveillance in many cases were still alive and in some cases still politically active. Number 11. The British government discovered that one of the most senior figures in MI6 was a Soviet spy, quietly let him confess in exchange for partial information, watched him flee to Moscow 3 days later, then spent years actively covering up the extent of its own failure. The Cambridge 5 case is often presented as a Cold War spy story, dramatic and now fully resolved. The declassified files from 2025 complicate that framing. A 2015 review of documents released to that point noted that MI5 and MI6 had worked actively to prevent information about the five from being disclosed not just to the British public, but also to the United States government. More than 20% of files related to the spy ring remained classified even at that stage, more than 50 years after most of the events they documented. The files show that the government conducted what a parliamentary review later described as a campaign to keep Philby's spying confidential to minimize political embarrassment. Philby had been the CIA's primary British liaison at exactly the period when the Venona decryption program was identifying Soviet agents in Western intelligence services. He was briefed on those operations. He passed what he knew to Moscow. The damage to Anglo-American intelligence cooperation was severe, and the damage to American confidence in British intelligence services lasted for years. The files make clear that the extent of this damage was something the British government was eager to control in how it was told. An April 11th, 1982 document in the declassified Falklands nuclear file notes a judgment from the chiefs of staff and then stops, the remainder withheld. A similar structure appears repeatedly across the Cambridge 5 releases. The papers come out. The key lines are still missing. Number 12. Britain's system of secrecy was itself a classified system, and the instruction given to officials across 37 countries was not just to destroy evidence, but to ensure that the destruction left no evidence that any destruction had occurred. This is perhaps the most precise expression of how British governmental secrecy worked in the 20th century. The instructions issued under Operation Legacy were not only about removing embarrassing documents, they were about removing any trace that such documents had ever existed, which meant removing any trace of the removal itself. Officials in Buganda received instructions in January 1962 from London, noting that legacy files must leave no reference to watch material, and that the very existence of the watch series, though it may be guessed at, should never be revealed. The W stamp that marked a sensitive watch document was to be locked away. The parallel filing system that separated documents for European eyes only from those that could be seen by incoming local government ministers was to be dismantled before those ministers arrived, with nothing to indicate it had existed. One colonial official in Uganda, going through the sensitive files in his office in 1962, wrote to London noting that some of the archives would be of immense interest to any future historian studying recent events in the territory. He suggested that certain files, which he described as containing a good deal of dirty material, be sent to the Colonial Office in Britain for possible future historical use. He noted that it was not practicable to separate the dirty material from the files themselves. His letter is in the archive. What happened to the files he described is not known. The instruction that Colonial Secretary MacLeod sent to all British posts in May 1961 was itself classified. The telegram telling officials to remove or destroy evidence of British conduct was evidence of British conduct. The British government did not acknowledge that the instruction had been sent until a judge in the Mau Mau case required it to. 12 items from the classified record of a country that presented itself to the world as a beacon of law, order, and institutional reliability. 31 nuclear weapons in a nuclear-free zone. 50 years of a spy at the heart of its intelligence services. Torture authorized in writing in Kenya. An underground city for the cabinet while the public faced annihilation. A signals agency nobody was allowed to know existed. And 36 countries' worth of documents burned, sunk, and hidden. And a formal instruction that the hiding of the evidence should leave no evidence that it had happened.